The last market we're going to look at this semester is that of an oligopoly. So we've looked at perfectly competitive markets, we've looked at monopolies, we've looked at monopolistic competition. The last one we're going to look at this semester is an oligopoly. So a monopoly had one supplier, monopolistic competition and perfect competition had lots of suppliers, so hundreds, thousands. An oligopoly is dominated by a few suppliers. So really, if you can kind of count on your fingers the number of businesses, then you have an oligopoly. Now, when we look at examples of oligopolies, an example of an oligopoly in Canada is the wireless or cell phone service market. When it comes to cell phone service, we have Rogers, Bell, and TELUS have over 94% of the market share. What looks like more competition, right? Fido, Virgin, Kudu, these all belong to Rogers, Bell, and TELUS. So it looks like there's more choice, but it's really the same companies. So Fido, for example, is part of Rogers, Virgin is part of Bell, Kudu is part of TELUS. So really, it's these three big companies controlling everything. If we look at the mass production of beer, okay, in the US, 80% of the US beer industry, so not craft beer, but when we look at mass-produced beer, Anheuser-Busch and Miller Coors control 80% of that industry. So we're going to be looking at is characteristics of the oligopoly and the impact it has, having a few suppliers has on the market. But first we have to look at how do we determine if we have an oligopoly. So when we look at whether or not we have an oligopoly, we need to measure the amount of market concentration. There are two different ways to measure market concentration. One is a concentration ratio that looks at market share, so the percentage of sales in the industry, by the largest firms. And so with the concentration ratio, we could look at, for example, the 2 largest firms, the 4 largest firms. What percentage of the market share do we have? Another alternative measure of concentration is the Herfindahl Hirschman index. So we're going to be looking at each one of these and comparing the two different methods. So let's start by looking at the concentration ratio. So this is mobile phone manufacturers. So these are the people who make your cell phones. And the Apple iPhone was released in 2007. So you can see within a year of that iPhone coming out, Apple had a teeny tiny market share. Not even enough to really make this map or graph pie chart that we see here on the right. So if we were to calculate the concentration ratio for the cell phone market in 2008, we could look at, for example, the 4 biggest firms. Okay, so we could take the 4 biggest firms and we could add up their market share. 39% plus 17% plus Sony Ericsson at 9% and Motorola at 8%. Okay. So we add that up and we can get our market share. And let's see. Let's just do a quick calculation here, figure out what that is. So pull up my calculator. 39 plus 17 plus 9 plus 8. 73%. So this is a highly consolidated market because notice there's one company, Nokia, that had almost 40% of the market, and the 4 biggest companies have over 3/4 of the market. Well, what has happened to this concentration ratio over time? Okay, so remember the top ones here are Nokia, Samsung, Sony, and Motorola. Here's 2015. Notice Samsung has now taken the lead with 24.4%. Those Apple iPhones became pretty popular and jumped to almost 18%. And then we have Lenovo and Huawei in 3rd and 4th place. Companies have disappeared, right? So before smartphones, Nokia was the biggest phone producer. And now that everybody wants a phone that is also a computer and can surf the internet, we see Samsung and Apple take the lead with those smartphones. So what has happened to the concentration ratio? Well, we take the four largest, 24.4 plus 17.9 plus 6.5 plus 5.1. If our concentration ratio is based on the four largest, we add these up, we get 53.9%. Okay, so notice that there's more competition than there used to be. We start to see a Huawei come in, that's a Chinese firm, and then Lenovo wasn't in the previous either. So there's more competitors entering the market. Now, let's go forward in time. This is 2020. And notice that Huawei has taken over as the leading producer of phones. They're now at 19.7%. Samsung in second at 19.6%. Apple has lost market share to Huawei and some of these competitors. They went from 17.9 to 13. And we now have a three-way tie for fourth place, so the fourth largest is sitting at 8%. So as we add these up, 19.7 plus 19.6, we get what? 60.3%. So notice the concentration ratio has gone up. There is more consolidation, less competition in the market, because now the four biggest firms are a bigger percentage. It's not like it was back in 2008 with Nokia having 40%. We have a smaller share from the top companies, but overall the four biggest companies have a bigger share overall. So there's some of these smaller companies, but really what we have is Huawei, Samsung, and Apple dominating this industry. So the concentration ratio gives us an indication of what's happening over time in terms of the amount of competition. We can look at some other examples. So this is the concentration ratios when it comes to the global market for beer. So the largest beer producer is Anheuser-Busch InBev. The second largest is Saab Miller. Now this data is from 2014. And in fact, see if I can get this to open here. In 2015, InBev and Saab Miller wanted to merge. They wanted to become one company. Well, what would be the impact of this? That means that this market share of the two top companies at 21% and 10% would then become one company, right? So now you have one company that has more than 30% of the market share. So when we start to see a lot of consolidation, when one company becomes so significantly bigger than everybody else, it creates an imbalance. This company has all the market power, too much influence on the market compared to everyone else. And so when it came to Anheuser-Busch and Saab Miller merging, they have to seek government approval if there's too much consolidation in the market. Okay. So the ruling was that they were allowed to merge, but they had to spin off some of their products to be separate businesses, that they couldn't maintain the full 31% of the market share. So they could merge, but they couldn't take all of their assets with them when they did so. You'll notice here, if you add up the top four before the merger, we're at 51.7%. And so think about if you then consolidate, the top two become one company has 30%, and so then the top four become an even higher percentage. Now, other examples of concentration ratios, these are Canadian ones from 2005. So it's a little hard to find these numbers readily available. So when it comes to motor vehicles, when we look at the consolidation in the market, there are a couple of companies, GM, Ford, that sell the majority of vehicles in Canada. There are other companies that are just a tiny fraction, a percentage, less than a percentage of the market share. So we have domination by a handful of companies. Other companies that are highly concentrated would be petroleum, tobacco, fertilizer, tires, chocolate. That's been an issue lately. We'll talk about that in a subsequent video. Household appliances, coffee, tea, wineries, where it's dominated by a handful of companies. This is out of the US from the New York Times, and it shows what's been happening to the amount of competition over time. So this one looks at the two biggest firms. So the concentration ratio does not have to be 4. We can choose to look at the top 2, the top 4, the top 5. But what you can see here is what's happening to that concentration ratio over time. So we add up the market share of the 2 largest companies. You can see hardware stores, Home Depot and Lowe's, basically dominate 80% of the market. Shipbuilding, private prisons, you can see tobacco, pharmacies, you can see meat processing, airlines, manufacturing of mattresses. All of this is becoming more consolidated. So what we're doing is we're putting all the market power into a handful of companies. This can impact the price the customers are charged, right? Because like we know, perfect competition versus monopoly, the more market power the business has, the more they can increase the price. So the more consolidation we have, the less competitors, the more we start to act like a monopoly. There's also a risk of collusion because one business's behavior impacts another. When there's only a couple of them, they start to be strategic in how they behave, thinking about what the other one does. This is fine until they get together and start working together on setting prices and quantities at the expense of the customer. That's why we monitor the level of market concentration. The other measure for the measure of the amount of concentration or the amount of competition in the market is what is called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So where the concentration ratio just looked at the 2 biggest firms or the 4 biggest firms, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index takes into consideration the market share, the percentage of sales for all the companies in the industry. Okay. So to calculate the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, we take the market share of each company and square it and add it together. So we get rid of the percentages. So if we have company 1 at 40%, company 2 at 30%, 3 at 20%, and 4 at 10%, we just take 40 squared plus 30 squared plus 20 squared plus 10 squared to get the index number. Okay. So if we do that, we get a Herfindahl-Hirschman index number of 3,000 for this example. Well, what does that mean? Well, in order to help figure out what that means, we need some extremes. We need to know highly competitive markets, what kind of number do they have? Monopolies, what kind of number do they have? So let's just make some notes. If you have a monopoly, how much of the market share do they have? 100%. So what would be their Herfindahl-Hirschman index number? 100 squared. All right, so we pull out the calculator, type in 100 squared. What do we get? Okay, we get 10,000. So the highest your Herfindahl-Hirschman index number can be is 10,000. Okay, so the bigger the number, the more consolidated or concentrated the market. What if we have 100 firms and they each have 1% of the market? So how would we find this? Well, we would do 1 squared plus 1 squared plus 1 squared 100 times, which is the same thing as doing 100 times 1 squared. Well, 1 squared is 1. 100 times 1 is 100. So a highly competitive market, 100 firms, they each have 1%, they're each super tiny, would have a Herfindahl-Hirschman number that's down to 100. So smaller number, lots of competition, bigger number, less competition. Okay. So let's go back to this one. When we look at the market for beer currently, okay, so this is 2014. When we look at the Herfindahl Hirschman index number for beer globally right now, the number globally is 725. Okay, so when we look at that, that seems on the lower side. Okay, so there seems to be a lot of competition for beer. So the lower numbers, more competition, higher numbers, more risk of collusion, more risk of higher prices. And so the idea with limiting the merger from Anheuser-Busch to Saab Miller is to prevent that Herfindahl Hirschman number from going up too much. Okay, so let's look a bit more detail at some different Herfindahl Hirschman index numbers. Generally, if HHI is less than 1,000, it is considered to be a competitive market, which means we have the benefits of that perfectly competitive market. Okay, in terms of a society perspective, more efficient businesses, lower prices for customers. So industries like paint and baked goods, boat building, these are Canadian. So here we see sporting and athletic goods as being a more competitive market. In the US, we saw it on the list of highly consolidated markets. But there's lots of different competitors when it comes to clothing. So there's like 2,600 different businesses that sell clothing. You'll notice the Herfindahl Hirschman index number is 50. Lots of businesses, all small. If we start to have one business that is much bigger than everybody else, right, then what that does is it makes the Herfindahl Hirschman index number go up. So this number is representative of the number of companies, and it also is influenced by how big the companies are, right? So the smallest number we saw was when they were all of equal size. But if we start to make one company bigger, so if we make one firm at 10% and the rest at 1%, then we can see this number go up. So it's based on the number of companies and the size of the companies. Here we have those who have a Herfindahl Hirschman index number greater than 1,800. If you have a Herfindahl Hirschman index number greater than 1,800, you are considered to be a concentrated or consolidated market. In Canada, these would include cigarettes. You'll notice in this case, we talked before, I think, about how the four largest firms have like 99% of the market share. So you can see their Herfindahl Hirschman index number is at 4,409. Chocolate, we said, was a highly consolidated market, 32 firms, Herfindahl Hirschman number at 2,198. Okay, so if it's less than 1,000, it's highly competitive. If it's more than 1,800, it's considered to be more concentrated. So what do we do about it? Well, since 1982 in the U.S., under the Department of Justice, the FTC, and the U.S. Attorney General, we've used these guidelines. So if it's less than 1,000, it's competitive. If it's more than 1,800, it's highly concentrated. If companies want to merge and it would increase the Herfindahl Hirschman index by more than 100 points in an already concentrated market, then they are investigated for antitrust behavior. That is collusion, impact on the customers of their merger. Is there too much of businesses working together at the expense of the customer? Now, this is in the U.S. So in the U.S. government can deny mergers. They can break up companies into pieces if they believe that it's anti-competitive behavior. And so what they use to help flag where there might be anti-competitive behavior is if there's too much consolidation, which is where the Herfindahl Hirschman index would go above 1,800, or a single merger would cause too much of a change in that HHI. So an example of this, see if I can pull up there's my graph. Although I think I just realized that, did it open? Okay. So this is a ruling about Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company, and another pharmaceutical company called Warner Lambert. So Pfizer and Warner Lambert. Both of these companies make Alzheimer drugs, and they wanted to merge. Well, we said before, I saw it somewhere, where was the list? That pharmacies were a highly consolidated market. In fact, before Pfizer and Warner Lambert were to merge, HHI was 1834. So this is above that threshold, highly consolidated market. If the two merged, because they are the only two that make Alzheimer drugs, the Herfindahl Hirschman index would be 10,000 in the market for Alzheimer drugs. So the government in the US said these two companies are allowed to become one, but if they do so, they have to sell off their Alzheimer drug production spin it off to be a separate company or sell it to a different company. They couldn't have one company be the provider of all Alzheimer drugs. So we said this was a U.S. measure, and if the HHI is above 1800 or the HHI moves too much, then they are flagged for what could be anti-competitive behavior. The government gets involved, and if it's a merger, the merger can be denied. In 2011, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, said that T-Mobile and AT&T were not allowed to merge because it would create too much consolidation in the market. So here you can see AT&T in this kind of gray color and T-Mobile in the darker blue. Their merger would increase HHI by more than 100 points, and particularly in the smartphone market. In the US, these two companies in 2011 were the primary providers of cell phone service. So their merger was denied based on the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Well, this is all American. What about Canada? What do we have in Canada? Well, in Canada, we don't have specific legislation like the US does about the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. However, we have been using the same guidelines and measurements that the US uses, that cutoff of 1800 and HHI by more than 100 points. We've been using that to make decisions for the Competitive Bureau of Canada and the Canadian Mergers and Enforcement Guidelines. So we've been using those US HHI guidelines to flag highly concentrated markets and deny mergers, even though we technically don't have any laws or regulations that refer specific to HHI. In 2004, the Bank of Canada recommended that the Competition Bureau actually require the calculation of HHI within industries if it would give a company more than 35% of the market share. So far, just recommendations, so it's at the discretion of the Competition Bureau as to whether or not they look at HHI and whether they use that to determine whether or not mergers should occur. But there are some examples of Canadian forbidding mergers of companies because it would change the market share or HHI too much. So for example, in 2015, the Canadian government forbid the merger of Staples and Office Depot. That would have given one company 80% of the market share. Before we leave the topic of the Herfindahl-Hirschman index and the concentration ratio, let's just do a bit of a comparison between the two. So the Herfindahl-Hirschman index includes all participants in the market, whereas the concentration ratio only considers the biggest firms. So we get more detail, more information from that Herfindahl-Hirschman index number. So for example, what if we had 90% market share, let's call it for company A, and we had 10% with company B? Okay, let's calculate the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Well, 90 squared plus 10 squared is 8,200. Two companies, one super big. Herfindahl-Hirschman index is really high. Highly concentrated market, lots of power with company A. What if you had company A with 90% of the market share and you had 10 companies, each with 1% of the market share? What would happen to that Herfindahl-Hirschman index? So still it's 90 squared, but now we're doing 1 squared and we're doing that 10 times. So notice the number goes down. It's still really high because there's that one company with 90% of the market share, but it's not as high when you have 10 companies with 1% versus one company with 10%. So it includes information about all the participants in the market, whereas the concentration ratio does not. So if you think about the concentration ratio, if the 4 largest companies don't change in size, and all we're doing is changing the remainder from there not being any more than 4 to being hundreds more that are each super tiny, it does change the market dynamics. So the HHI reflects this. The concentration ratio wouldn't change. So HHI includes all participants in the market. It gives us slightly more information because it tells us about the size of the company and the number of competitors. So really what we're looking at is we're looking about the structure of the market and the risk of coordinated behavior. The bigger the companies and the less companies there are, the more likely they are to price fix, collude, and create prices that are at the expense of the customer. The downside to the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is that its interpretation is somewhat arbitrary. So remember that we're using this cutoff of higher than 1,800 is a highly consolidated market. And if the HHI moves more than 100 points, then we should flag it for investigation as to whether or not the merger gets approved. These cutoffs of 100 points and 1,800 were arbitrarily set by the US. Other countries, the European Union, Australia, use other cutoffs. So the numbers are a bit arbitrary in terms of where you choose to focus or not focus. To help you see once more just the difference between the Herfindahl-Hirschman index versus the concentration ratio, if we look specifically at the US, in 1947, the top 5 beer producers in the US had 19% total of the market share. So if we're using the concentration ratio, top 5, 19%, lots of competition. In 1947, that Herfindahl-Hirschman index would have been 140. Very low, highly competitive market. Remember that 100 companies with 1% each is 100. So today, Anheuser-Busch and Miller's Coors control 80% of the U.S. beer industry, with that Anheuser-Busch InBev at 51% and Miller Coors at 30%. And that was before our discussion about, whoop, I don't know where that went. Now apparently I'm buying socks. Go away. Right? So this information is before, I give up, before they wanted to merge. So the concern here is that you have 2 companies that already control 80% of the U.S. market at 51 and 30%, wanting to merge even further. So when we look at today, we're looking at a Herfindahl-Hirschman index of about 2,900 in the U.S., and we said that globally there is more competition, right? The global market was more competitive at 725. So remember, you also have to define your market, geographic area, type of product. Okay, so what type of market are we looking at? And when the US makes a decision about approving mergers, it's looking at it just from its country's perspective. Canada, the same thing. Well, these are international companies, and so they often have to get approval from multiple companies in order to have the mergers and acquisitions because of the laws regarding competitive behavior in different countries.